just to be clear, back during the 1960s civil rights movement, when young men and women from the Student Nonviolent Committee would sit at lunch counters trying to integrate lunch counters and diners that were in segregated Jim Crow states. It was an act of protest, but they weren't protesting lunch. They were protesting the policies of racial segregation. They weren't anti-sandwich. They were anti-hatred and racism. Similarly, when you had the Montgomery Bus Boycott, again, out of the civil rights movement, they weren't anti-bus. They were anti-segregation. And the policies that made white people sit here and the African American and black passengers ride separately as though they weren't good enough or weren't important. It wasn't anti-bus. It was anti-racism that was going on there. Even in our own founding stories that we tell about the American Project, right? We tell the story about the Boston Tea Party, which wasn't a protest that was anti-tea, but was anti-taxation from the across the ocean British Empire colonizing and overtaxing colonists here in what would become the United States. I suppose anytime you take an action that's symbolic and it's meant to be a protest against something, you run the risk that it will be misunderstood or that some people will willfully try and misconstrue what it's all about. That's true of protests and symbolic actions of the distant past, like the Boston Tea Party, to modern protest movements or symbolic actions as well. And it's true even if it's Jesus. This is one of those things that I think it took me a long time to realize how much of Jesus' ministry and action is intentional and deliberate provocation of the way things work. And that often the closest analogy we have in our culture is a protest action, right? Something like the sit-in in a segregated lunch counter or the Montgomery Bus Boycott. For example, there is this scene, we're going to hear it this coming Sunday, when Jesus goes into the temple in Jerusalem and he starts overturning the tables where the money changers had been basically operating cash registers in the house of God, where you could buy or sell animals for sacrifice that then were ritually killed on site and then offered up as sacrifices. Jesus drives them all out, even using a whip to drive out the animals from that space, basically shutting things down for that day. Now, this is scandalous, right? This would be like if somebody walked into the middle of a church service and started knocking over the offering plates and slamming the piano and breaking all the equipment so that we couldn't continue having the worship service. It would be repairable, right? We could get it all fixed, but it would clearly be a show of protest. Something was upsetting whoever was doing all those things, and it would be scandalous, right? It would be easy to take that as, whoever has done this thing, they must be anti-God, right? They must hate God, and that's why they're doing such a terrible act of vandalism and disturbing the peace. That's what happens to Jesus. People hear and see what he does there in the temple, and they take it as, he's anti-God. This guy's crazy. He's opposed to God. Well, that's, again, sort of missing the point. The sit-ins and the lunch counters weren't protesting lunch. The Montgomery Bus Boycott wasn't protesting buses. They were protesting the way systemic racism had poisoned those things. It might have been good and fine on their own. Lunch is great. Busing is fine. It's a question of how sin and evil had corrupted those systems, in that case with racism that was institutionalized. In the temple in Jesus' day, there are so many ways that the notion of connecting with God had gotten corrupted, had gotten sort of devolved into something transactional. Now, it's possible that there's cheating going on, that there are people who are selling diseased animals or bad animals. I suppose there could be corruption or something going on, but I think even more crucially, Jesus is just saying this whole monstrosity, this whole complex, we've turned our connection with God into something that can be commodified, like it's a transaction. Like I come in, I pay a certain amount of money to have an animal die and cover my sins, and now I can go back to being a jerk again. There are so many ways we abuse our relationship with God by turning it into a commodity, turning it into a transaction, turning it into a business where God's grace and favor are available for sale to the highest bidder. Part of what Jesus does that day in the temple is to critique all of it, to protest all of it, and to say maybe for whatever good intentions there might have been for having a temple once upon a time, look what you've done to it. This isn't what God intended. This wasn't God's purpose anyway. After all, in the ancient stories of the Hebrew Scriptures, when people start suggesting the idea of let's build a temple for God, after all, God needs to have a nice house to live in, you might remember God's kind of ambivalent about the whole idea and says back to King David, who first proposes the idea, whoever said I needed a house? After all, I'm God. I fill all the universe. When did I ever say I needed a house? I've just gone with you, my people, everywhere you've gone. I don't need a building to come to. The things that we treat as buildings or houses for God end up being cages for our mental pictures of God. And once you've got God in a box, or at least once you think you've got your mental idea of God in a box, that becomes easier to control, to tame, to domesticate, and to turn into your personal mascot. When Jesus goes into the temple and sees the ways that basically respectable religion was trying to domesticate God and turn God's favor into something you could buy for sale, Jesus says this isn't what it was meant to be. The action that day, he knows, is at best symbolic. It's not going to destroy or stop the temple from operating for a long term. Probably by the next day it was back to business as usual. But Jesus has definitely drawn a line in the sand, has definitely staked his claim in the ground to say this isn't what God has intended. It's worth asking, even 2,000 years later, what are the ways we're still tempted to turn our connection with the living God into a commodity for sale? Over the history of Christianity, we keep falling for it, right? Even when we don't realize we're doing it. Those are the kind of corruptions and abuses that led a monk named Martin Luther to start questioning the practices of the church in his day, because it sure sounded in his day like the church's teaching was if you paid a certain amount of money, you could get your loved ones out of some place after death called purgatory. And he thought that sounded like you've turned it into a transaction. You've turned it into a business. That's not how God operates. That's trying to cage and commodify God, after all. And what do you know? Even at that time, all the money raised was meant to build a giant edifice that became St. Peter's Basilica. We have a way, even with the best of intentions, of thinking we're doing something good for God and turning God into a commodity that's available for buying and selling, and reducing God then into a product that I can own and control and use as I want. And God has never been that. Jesus knows that by taking the action he does there in the temple, he will make some powerful enemies, and they will start accusing him of being anti-God when he's really opposed to commodifying and domesticating God. Just like the people who did the sit-ins in the lunch counters in the civil rights movement, or the Montgomery Bus Boycott, were all accused of just being troublemakers who were anti-lunch or anti-bus. It's clear that's not what was going on. The challenge for us as followers of Jesus is how to let Jesus keep shaking us up. And maybe that there are going to be places and times where Jesus is the one leading us to those kinds of critiques or protests where there's evil and rottenness around us and even within us. It's difficult for us to maybe take an honest look at where are the places in our own lives, in our own world, in the things that we're comfortable with, that are rotten, that are unjust or uncompassionate, that don't fit with the character of the God we met in Jesus. It's difficult sometimes to find the courage to say, no, this isn't how things are supposed to be. But maybe that's where Jesus is leading us, to be people who are able to say, God isn't reducible to a commodity or a transaction. God's presence with us isn't something you can buy or sell or domesticate or tame. And that for all the ways and places we fall for that, we need Jesus to come overturn tables in our own lives. Maybe that's what we need to hear on this day. As lovely as spaces like this are, not to confuse them with the living God, who always breaks out of whatever building or cage or confines we put God in, and is always on the loose setting things right, even if that means also overturning tables. Maybe this week the challenge for us is to allow Jesus to overturn some tables in our hearts that we've been afraid to let get tipped over. And maybe that will allow Jesus to point us back to what's real and true and solid, to point us back to him. Jesus is willing to do all that, even knowing it's going to anger people who are going to want to destroy him and crucify him, and he does it anyway. That is the vision that we're led to this Lent. To be people who are so committed to following the way of Jesus that we're willing even to lay down our lives like Jesus did, to walk the way of the cross. That's the conversation we're having this coming Sunday as we hear this story as John's Gospel records it. And we hope you'll join us for that conversation. See you then.